Part 2. Excesses. Introduction. Deficit is any disturbance of function. What then of the opposite, an excess or superabundance of function? In psychiatry, where one speaks of excited and productive disorders, extravagances of fancy, of impulse, of mania. Where one speaks of hypertrophies, monstrosities of teratoma. But physiology has no equivalent for this, no equivalent of monstrosities or manias. Thus, Luria's two clinical biographies are nicely balanced. The Man with a Shattered World is about loss, the Mind of a Mnemonist about excess. In Awakenings there was an internal balance, between the terrible privation seen before L-dopa, akinesia, abulia, adenomia, anergia, etc., and the almost equally terrible excesses after L-dopa, hyperkinesia, hyperbolia, hyperdynamia, etc. Enhancement allows the possibilities not only of a healthy fullness and exuberance, but of the sort of too muchness which continually loomed in Awakenings, as patients, overexcited, tended to disintegration and uncontrol, and overpowering by impulse, image, and will, possession, or dispossession, by a physiology gone wild. This is built into the nature of growth and life. Growth can become overgrowth, life hyperlife. All the hyperstates can become monstrous, perverse aberrations, parastates. Hyperkinesia tends towards parakinesia, abnormal movements, chorea, tics. Hypernosia readily becomes paragnosia, perversions, apparitions, of the morbidly heightened senses. The ardors of hyperstates can become violent passions. Wellness, and wrongness. In Awakenings, patients profoundly ill, with the profoundest deficits, for many decades, might find themselves, suddenly well, only to move from there into the hazards, the tribulations, of excess, function stimulated far beyond allowable limits. Rose R., in the first flush and joy of restored health, said, "It's fabulous, it's gorgeous," but as things accelerated towards uncontrol said, "Things can't last. Something awful is coming." As with Leonard L., as he passed from repletion to excess, his abundance of health and energy of grace, as he called it, became too abundant, and started to assume an extravagant form. This fear is expressed by witty Tiki Ray in chapter 10 when he says, "I consist of tics, there is nothing else," or when he envisages a mind growth, a teratoma which might engulf him. For him, with his strong ego, and relatively mild Tourette syndrome, there was not any such danger. But for patients with weak or undeveloped egos, coupled with overwhelmingly strong disease, there is a very real risk of such possession or dispossession. 10 Witty Tiki Ray. In 1885, Gilles de la Tourette described Tourette syndrome, is characterized by an excess of nervous energy, and a great production and extravagance of strange motions and notions, tics, jerks, mannerisms, grimaces, noises, curses, involuntary imitations and compulsions of all sorts. In its highest forms, involves every aspect of the affective, the instinctual, and the imaginative life. In its lower forms, there may be little more than abnormal movements and impulsivity. Luria remarked of his mnemonist, a fight between an it and an I. In the 1920s, in the hyperkinetic or frenzied forms which the sleepy sickness sometimes took, these patients tended, at the beginning of their illness, to show a mounting excitement of mind and body, violent movements, tics, compulsions of all kinds. Some time afterwards, they were overtaken by an opposite fate, an all-enveloping trance-like sleep. In 1969, I gave these sleepy sickness or post-encephalitic patients L-dopa, a precursor of the transmitter dopamine, which was greatly lowered in their brains. First, they were awakened from stupor to health, then they were driven towards the other pole of tics and frenzy. In 1974, I founded Tourette Syndrome Association. It has a few thousand. It has encouraged research from the physiological to the sociological, research into the biochemistry of the Tourettic brain, on genetic and other factors, on the abnormally rapid and indiscriminate associations and reactions which characterize it. Instinctual and behavioral structures. Tourette syndrome indeed has an organic neurological basis. The it in Tourette's, like the it in Parkinsonism and chorea, reflects what Pavlov called the blind force of the subcortex, a disturbance of those primitive parts of the brain which govern go and drive. In Parkinsonism, which affects motion but not action as such, the disturbance lies in the midbrain and its connections. In chorea, which is a chaos of fragmentary quasi-actions, the disorder lies in higher levels of the basal ganglia. In Tourette's, where there is excitement of the emotions and the passions, a disorder of the primal, instinctual basis of behavior, the disturbance seems to lie in the very highest parts of the old brain, the thalamus, hypothalamus, limbic system, and amygdala, where the basic affective and instinctual determinants of personality are lodged. Thus Tourette's pathologically no less than clinically constitutes a sort of missing link between body and mind, and lies, so to speak, between chorea and mania. As in the rare, hyperkinetic forms of encephalitis lethargica, and in all post-encephalitic patients overexcited by L-dopa, patients with Tourette syndrome, or Tourettism from any other cause, strokes, cerebral tumors, intoxications, or infections, seem to have an excess of exciter transmitters in the brain, especially the transmitter dopamine. And as lethargic Parkinsonian patients need more dopamine to arouse them, as my post-encephalitic patients were awakened by the dopamine precursor L-dopa, so frenetic and touretic patients must have had their dopamine lowered by a dopamine antagonist, such as the drug haloperidol, Haldol. But there are also much subtler and more widespread changes. There are countless subtle paths of abnormality which differ from patient to patient, and from day to day. Haldol can be an answer to Tourette's, but neither it nor any other drug can be the answer, any more than L-dopa is the answer to Parkinsonism. There must also be an existential approach, sensitive understanding of action, art, and play as being in essence healthy and free, and thus antagonistic to crude drives and impulsions, to the blind force of the subcortex from which these patients suffer. The motionless Parkinsonian can sing and dance, and when he does so is completely free from his Parkinsonism, and when the galvanized Tourette sings, plays, or acts, he in turn is completely liberated from his Tourette's. Here the I vanquishes and reigns over the it. Patient Ray, 24 years old, and almost incapacitated by multiple tics of extreme violence coming in volleys every few seconds. He had been subject to these since the age of 4 and severely stigmatized by the attention they aroused. Since leaving college, he had been fired from a dozen jobs always because of tics, never for incompetence. He was remarkably musical, and his Tourette's was also of advantage in various games, especially ping pong, because of improvisations, very sudden, nervous, frivolous shots, which were so unexpected and startling as to be virtually unanswerable. The only time he was free from tics was in post-coital quiescence or in sleep, or when he swam or sang or worked, evenly and rhythmically, and found a kinetic melody, a play, which was tension-free, tic-free and free. He had never heard of the TSA, nor had he heard of Haldol. He had diagnosed himself as having Tourette's after reading the article on tics in the Washington Post. I started him on Haldol, prescribing a dose of 1/4 milligram 3 times a day. He came back, the following week, with a black eye and a broken nose and said, "So much for your fucking Haldol." Even this minute dose had thrown him off balance, interfered with his speed, his timing, his preternaturally quick reflexes. He presented a picture of marked Parkinsonism, dystonia, catatonia, and psychomotor block, in reaction which seemed inauspicious in the extreme, suggesting, not insensitivity, but such oversensitivity, such pathological sensitivity, that perhaps he could only be thrown from one extreme to another, from acceleration and Touretteism to catatonia and Parkinsonism, with no possibility of any happy medium. "Suppose you could take away the tics," he said. "What would be left?" "I consist of tics, there is nothing else." He called himself the ticker of President's Broadway, and spoke of himself, in the third person, as Witty Ticky Ray. He said he could not imagine life without Tourette's, nor was he sure he would care for it. I suggested that we meet weekly for a period of 3 months. During this time, we would try to imagine life without Tourette's, we would explore, if only in thought and feeling, how much life could offer, and then make another trial of Haldol. All sorts of healthy and human potentials came to light. For when I again tried Ray on Haldol, in the same minute dose as before, he now found himself tic-free, but without significant ill effects, and he has remained this way for the past 9 years. Its initial effects were close to catastrophic, partly, no doubt, on a physiological basis. Having had Tourette's since the age of 4, Ray had no experience of any normal life. He was heavily dependent on his exotic disease and, not unnaturally, employed and exploited it in various ways. He had not been ready to give up his Tourette's and, I cannot help thinking, might never have been ready without those 3 months of intense preparation. He enjoys a spaciousness and freedom he would never have thought possible. His marriage is tender and stable, and he is now a father as well. He has many good friends. Yet problems perhaps inseparable from having Tourette's and Haldol. Ray remains sober, solid, square. On Haldol he is slow and deliberate in his movements and judgments, with none of the impatience, the impetuosity, he showed before Haldol, but equally, none of the wild improvisations and inspirations. Even his dreams are different in quality, straight wish fulfillment, he says, with none of the elaborations, the extravaganzas, of Tourette's. He is less sharp, less quick in repartee, no longer bubbling with witty tics or ticky wit. He no longer enjoys or excels at ping-pong or other games. He found that on Haldol he was musically dull, average, competent, but lacking energy, enthusiasm, extravagance, and joy. Ray made a momentous decision. He would take Haldol dutifully throughout the working week, but would take himself off it, and let fly, at weekends. There is the sober citizen, the calm deliberator, from Monday to Friday, and there is Witty Ticky Ray, frivolous, frenetic, inspired, at weekends. Ray is the first to admit. You normals, who have the right transmitters in the right places at the right times in your brains, have all feelings, all styles, available all the time, gravity, levity, whatever is appropriate. We Tourette's don't, We are forced into levity by our Tourette's and forced into gravity when we take Haldol. You are free, you have a natural balance, we must make the best of an artificial balance. Ray would say, with Nietzsche. I have traversed many kinds of health, and keep traversing them. And as for sickness, are we not almost tempted to ask whether we could get along without it? Only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. Ray has achieved what Nietzsche liked to call the great health, rare humor, valor, and resilience of spirit, despite being, or because he is, afflicted with Tourette's. 11. Cupid's disease. Natasha K., 90 years old. She took an interest in a young man. Some friends started to think it was not quite appropriate. You were always so shy, they said, and now you're a flirt. You giggle, you tell jokes at your age, is that right? She wondered, what could justify such a sudden euphoria? It was something in my body, my brain, that was making me high. And then I thought, God damn it, it's Cupid's disease. Yes, syphilis, you know. I was in a brothel in Salonika, nearly 70 years ago. I caught syphilis, lots of the girls had it, we called it Cupid's disease. My husband saved me, took me out, had it treated. That was years before penicillin, of course. Could it have caught up with me after all these years? That's an amazing suggestion, I replied after some thought. She was right, the spinal fluid was positive, she did have neurosyphilis, it was indeed the spirochete stimulating her ancient cerebral cortex. I don't know that I want it treated, she said. I know it's an illness, but it's made me feel well. I've enjoyed it, I still enjoy it, I won't deny it. I guessed I had Cupid's, that's why I came to you. I don't want it to get worse, that would be awful, but I don't want it cured. We have given her penicillin, which has killed the spirochetes, but can do nothing to reverse the cerebral changes, the disinhibitions, they have caused. And now Mrs. K has it both ways, enjoying a mild disinhibition, a release of thought and impulse, without any threat to her self-control or of further damage to her cortex. Postscript. January 1985, another patient, Miguel O., with a diagnosis of mania, but soon realized to be suffering from the excited stage of neurosyphilis. The micrographia of Haldol, I don't see things anymore, he said. It looked so real, it looked so alive before. Will everything seem dead when I am treated? The drawings of patients with Parkinsonism, as they are awakened by L-DOPA, form an instructive analogy. Asked to draw a tree, the Parkinsonian tends to draw a small, meager thing, stunted, impoverished, a bare winter tree with no foliage at all. As he is animated by L-DOPA, so the tree acquires vigor, life, imagination, and foliage. If he becomes too excited, high, on L-DOPA, the tree may acquire a fantastic ornateness and exuberance. Such drawings are also rather characteristic of Tourette's, the original form, the original thought, lost in a jungle of embellishment and in the so-called speed art of amphetaminism. First the imagination is awakened, then excited, frenzied, to endlessness and excess. Excited animation, flying a kite, drugged, treated. Imagination and animation gone, what an irony, that inner life and imagination may lie dull and dormant unless released, awakened, by an intoxication or disease. And, no doubt, for the peculiar uncertainty which may attach to a drug like cocaine, which is known, like L-DOPA, or Tourette's, to raise the brain's dopamine. Thus, Freud's startling comment about cocaine, that the sense of well-being and euphoria it induces, in no way differs from the normal euphoria of the healthy person. In other words, you are simply normal, and it is soon hard to believe that you are under the influence of any drug. The same paradoxical valuation may attach to electrical stimulations of the brain. There are epilepsies which are exciting and addictive and may be self-induced, repeatedly, by those who are prone to them, as rats, with implanted cerebral electrodes, compulsively stimulate the pleasure centers of their own brain. A wellness can be genuine even if caused by an illness. Where illness may be wellness, and normality illness, where excitement may be either bondage or release, and where reality may lie in ebriety, not sobriety. It is the very realm of Cupid and Dionysus. 12. A matter of identity. William Thompson. Just a little trouble with your memory, difficulties remembering and recognizing people. Mr. Thompson would identify me, misidentify, pseudo-identify me as a dozen different people in the course of 5 minutes. He was, an ex-grocer, with severe Korsakoffs, in a neurological institution. Mr. Thompson got out of hospital. His Korsakoffs had exploded just 3 weeks before, when he developed a high fever, raved, and ceased to recognize all his family, of the sort called Korsakoff psychosis, though it is not really a psychosis at all, continually creating a world and self, to replace what was continually being forgotten and lost. It might be said that each of us constructs and lives a narrative, and that this narrative is us, our identities. If we wish to know about a man, we ask what is his story, his real, inmost story. For each of us is a biography, a story. Each of us is a singular narrative. To be ourselves we must have ourselves possess, if need be repossess, our life stories. A man needs such a narrative, a continuous inner narrative, to maintain his identity, his self. This narrative need, is the clue to Mr. Thompson's desperate tale-telling, his verbosity. Mr. Thompson is a man who, in some sense, is desperate, in a frenzy. The world keeps disappearing, losing meaning, vanishing, and he must seek meaning, make meaning, in a desperate way. But does Mr. Thompson himself know this, feel this? He never stops, they say. He's like a man in a race, a man trying to catch something which always eludes him. And, indeed, he can never stop running, for the breach in memory, in existence, in meaning, is never healed, but has to be patched, every second. But the patches, fail to work because they are confabulations, fictions, which cannot do service for reality. And with this, no feeling that he has lost feeling, for the feeling he has lost, no feeling that he has lost the depth, that unfathomable, mysterious, myriad-level depth which somehow defines identity or reality. One day he thought about his brother, perhaps some strand of memory, of remembered kinship, or identity, was still holding, or came back for an instant. William spoke of his elder brother, George, using his invariable present indicative tense. It was this which convinced me, above everything, that there was some ultimate and total loss of inner reality, of feeling and meaning, of soul. For William, with his manifest indifference to relation and reality caught in an unending verbosity, there may be nothing redeeming at all, his confabulations, his apparitions, his frantic search for meanings, being the ultimate barrier to any meaning. Paradoxically, William's great gift is also his damnation. If only he could be quiet, one feels, for an instant, then reality might seep in, something genuine, something deep, something true, something felt, could enter his soul. But William is so damned he does not know he is damned, for it is not just a faculty, or some faculties, which are damaged, but the very citadel, the self, the soul itself. But most interesting, the presence of plants, a quiet garden, the non-human order, making no social or human demands upon him, allow this identity delirium to relax, to subside, allow him a rare quietness and self-sufficiency of his own, by offering a deep wordless communion with nature itself, and with this the restored sense of being in the world, being real. 13. Yes, father sister. Mrs. B. had becoming funny, impulsive and superficial, but she turned out to have a cerebral tumor, a huge carcinoma involving the orbitofrontal aspects of both frontal lobes. I said. You realize the difference between a father, a sister, a doctor? I know the difference, but it means nothing to me. Father, sister, doctor. Thereafter, she would say, yes, father sister. Yes, sister doctor, and other combinations. Testing left-right discrimination was oddly difficult, because she said left or right indifferently, though there was not any confusion of the two, as when there is a lateralizing defect of perception or attention. She said, left/right. Right/left. Why the fuss? You could call them enantiomorphs of each other. But they mean nothing to me. They're no different for me. Hands. Doctors. Sisters. Don't you understand? They mean nothing to me. Nothing means anything. At least to me. This is the effect of the equalization described by Luria. Postscript. The sort of facetious indifference and equalization, Witzelsucht call it, joking disease, and it was recognized as a fundamental form of nervous dissolution by Hugh Lings Jackson. Occasionally I am not sure, at first, if the patient is just being funny, clowning around, or schizophrenic. How much is cryptomnesia confabulation, how much frontal lobe indifference equalization, how much some strange schizophrenic disintegration and shattering flattening? Of all forms of schizophrenia, the silly happy, the so-called hebephrenic, most resembles the organic amnestic and frontal lobe syndromes. Funny and often ingenious as they appear, the world is taken apart, undermined, reduced to anarchy and chaos. There ceases to be any center to the mind, though its formal intellectual powers may be perfectly preserved. The end point is silliness, an abyss of superficiality, in which all is ungrounded and afloat and comes apart. 14. The possessed. In Witty Ticky Ray, I suggested that some people could accommodate Tourette's within a commodious personality, while others might indeed be possessed, and scarcely able to achieve real identity amid the tremendous pressure and chaos of tourettic impulses, which might disintegrate the personality, and lead to a bizarre, phantasmagoric, pantomimic, and often impersonatory form of psychosis or frenzy called super-Tourette's, or Tourette psychosis. It has the frenzied motor psychoses sometimes induced by L-dopa and, on the other, to the confabulatory frenzies of Korsakoff psychosis. And like these it can almost overwhelm the person. The clinic, the laboratory, the wards are all designed to restrain and focus behavior, if not indeed to exclude it altogether. They are for a systematic and scientific neurology, reduced to fixed tests and tasks, not for an open, naturalistic neurology. A street in New York, where the subject of extravagant, impulsive disorders can enjoy and exhibit to the full the monstrous liberty, or slavery, of their condition. Street neurology. Parkinsonism, indeed, cannot be fully seen, comprehended, in the clinic. It requires an open, complexly interactional space for the full revelation of its peculiar character. And if this is true of Parkinsonism, how much truer must it be of Tourette's? One day, my eye was caught by a gray-haired woman in her 60s, what on earth was convulsing her and, also convulsing everyone whom she gnashingly, titula passed? But, she was imitating the passers-by. Every mirroring was also a parody, a mocking, an exaggeration of salient gestures and expressions, but an exaggeration in itself no less convulsive than intentional. She caricatured the features of 40 or 50 passers-by, each lasting a second or two, sometimes less, and the whole dizzying sequence scarcely more than 2 minutes. Also, some people in the street, took on these expressions in reaction to her, and those expressions, in turn, were re-reflected, redirected, redistorted, by the Tourette, causing a still greater degree of outrage and shock. But, this woman who, becoming everybody, lost her own self became nobody. And not a second too late, she delivered one vast, pantomimic egurgitation, in which the engorged identities of the last 50 people who had possessed her were spewed out. And if the taking in had lasted 2 minutes, the throwing out was a single exhalation 50 people in 10 seconds, a fifth of a second or less for the time foreshortened repertoire of each person. Korsakovian is driven by amnesia, absence, the Tourette is driven by extravagant impulse of which he is both the creator and the victim, impulse he may repudiate, but cannot disown. Thus, he is impelled, as the Korsakovian is not, into an ambiguous relation with his disorder, vanquishing it, being vanquished by it, playing with it. Lacking the normal, protective barriers of inhibition, the Tourette's ego is subject to a lifelong bombardment. Will identity survive? Can it develop, in face of such a shattering, such pressures, or will it be overwhelmed, to produce a Touretteized soul? To this extent he is a Humean rather than a human being. If the ratio of impulse to self is too overwhelming, it has affinities to a Freudian fate, which is also to be overwhelmed by impulse, but the Freudian fate has sense, albeit tragic, whereas a Humean fate is meaningless and absurd. The super Tourette, then, is compelled to fight, as no one else is, simply to survive, to become an individual, and survive as one, in face of constant impulse. He may be faced, from earliest childhood, with extraordinary barriers to individuation, to becoming a real person. The miracle is that, in most cases, he succeeds, for the powers of survival, of the will to survive, and to survive as a unique inalienable individual, are, absolutely, the strongest in our being, stronger than any impulses, stronger than disease. Health militant, is usually the victor.